Hey Nate, how you doing? What are you up to this weekend?
Jay, what's going on? I'm at Mesa Verde actually. I'm sitting in a campground outside Durango with the family, just hanging out, and it's awesome that I'm able to talk to you right now. Right, technology is a beautiful thing. So I went to Mesa Verde today, walked through the ruins, and now I'm here doing a podcast.
That is awesome. Well, my weekend, I'm here in Austin having a great time, and it's really because I've got the three B's happening this weekend. I've got my bourbon. Whoops, that was terrible. Here we go. I got some bourbon as we're having our conversation here. I've got a brisket on the smoker, and tomorrow I'm going to do a bike ride. So make sure I hit the mountain bike trails.
That sounds epic, and it sounds 100% you. So yeah, awesome. Let's remind the viewers who we are, and let's talk about what we got going on today.
Okay. Hey, so I'm Jay Maselli, co-founder of Red Thread X, and I've known Nate for about 10 years here. Like I said, I live in Austin. Hobbies are mountain biking and being outdoors, and incredibly excited and proud of what we get to do with this team.
And I'm Nate Platts. I am on the Red Thread X team. I do product and data. I worked with Jay many years ago, and I get to rework with him again, and I love every minute of it. The Red Thread X team is awesome, and I'm having a blast. And today we're going to talk to you about what we talked to you kind of last time, right? We are Red Thread X, and this is Red Thread X the future. We bring you the signal from the noise. We take all the chaos out of everything going on in the world, everything going on like big events like South by, CES, all the reports that come out in the monthly or the quarterly periodicals from these large firms, and any crazy idea out there, and we tell you how to make sense of it and how to find the common themes that run throughout those, and those are the red threads.
The last podcast, we talked about who we are, what we do, and we mentioned that we were introducing at that point in time our first quarterly report for the Proactive Quarter, which we called the Pluot Report. So this podcast is going to be an overview of that report, because the next couple of podcasts, we're going to dive deep into those topics and really have some tough conversations about the 5 red threads that were the core of this first report.
Yeah, the predictive quarter, right? And we called it the Pluot. We're going to get into the Pluot. The Pluot's a pretty unique thing, but that predictive quarter was awesome. We went to CES, we went to South by Southwest. We formed this team. We read and we dug through the internet, and we had awesome conversations. And from all of those came the Pluot Report, the predictive report, the first Red Thread X quarterly report, and it is awesome. And I can't wait to talk to you guys about all of the 5 red threads that we discovered.
That's awesome, Nate. What a great way to kick things off. And so the Pluot, let me just tell you really quickly what that is. So the Pluot is a hybrid fruit that's a crossbreed of a plum and an apricot. And by all reports, it's a superior fruit. I've not been able to try it yet. I keep going to my local grocery store here in Texas. It's HEB. Keep going to that national grocery store where they wear Hawaiian shirts, and no luck with finding a Pluot yet. But we saw it as being an analogy to the convergence of humanity and technology that we're seeing right now. Could it be better? Could it be like the plum and the apricot and this what's reportedly superior Pluot? Or could it be something worse, or something bad, or something even destructive?
Yeah, and I'm going to shout out to Matt Daly, a good friend of the show and friend of Red Thread X, right? He read the report and he called it a plutocracy, which I love, right? And so the name of this episode is the plutocracy. But that Pluot, it's a really great visual for what this report is, that convergence you talked about, AI and humanity, biotechnology, synthetic data, all of this kind of coming to a head. It reminds me of the quote that Amy Webb said on stage, right? There are decades where weeks happen, and there are weeks where decades happen. Originally a Lenin quote, and she dropped it on the stage at South by, and it was like, man, like this is definitely the last like 5 weeks have been weeks where decades happen, right? Just when I feel that I have my finger on the pulse of what is happening out there that makes sense, something else drops, and it's like, man, I did not see that coming. This is just so exciting.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the decades where weeks happen, and conversely, the weeks where decades happen, because in some respects, a lot of what we're seeing right now is not new, but it's moving at such a fast pace, and governance and regulation is so far behind. So, as an example, people have been breeding fruits and plants and dogs and all sorts of other stuff for millennial. It's how we get certain breeds of dogs, and some are very effective dogs. Others are, you kind of scratch your head and wonder why somebody bred that out. But it's moving so quickly, and it's enabled by AI, quantum computing as it's forthcoming, and all of the other technological elements that it feels like we're moving at a breakneck pace right now.
It does, and that's actually one of the threads. I'll break the order of what we're going to talk about, but that's one of the threads we identified, right? Synthetic everything, kind of, what we're doing with that synthetic everything. One of the things that stood out for me as we were discovering this, we wrote about it in the report, was bodyoids, right? A synthetic body that allows you to grow organs and harvest organs. And so, I have family that's in the medical field, and we talk about medicine a lot, but the organ wait list for like a heart transplant or for a liver transplant, you name it, right? What if and I had this vision, we were writing about this, but you just go to a store or a marketplace and you're able to say, hey, listen, here's my DNA type, here's my blood type, I want that liver. And I joke about that kind of flippantly, but if you could use a bodyoid to reduce the wait time for an organ transplant, wow, that's pretty remarkable. And that has a lot of benefits or potential benefits for longevity of our lifespans. But then lots of questions come from that. Who has access to that? Who pays for that? What's the ethical, considerations of growing a bodyoid for the harvesting of organs?
Right.
There's a lot that we unpack in this report on that.
There is. I mean, just the bodyoid thing alone, and we'll save that for that deep dive discussion. But there's so many different things. What's a superior organ? A natural, an organ from a person that was born through a birth canal, or an organ that was grown in a lab, or an organ that's grown in a bodyoid. And then, like you said, the sentience and everything else. So I'm going to really look
I
forward
think
when we do that.
the one that keeps me alive longest is the most superior organ.
Oh, okay. But I want to take that thread and I want to talk about another red thread that we map out then. So it's one thing
Okay.
to live a long time, but what is the quality of your life if you live longer? And then what are the economic and healthcare and societal impacts if not only are you living longer, a term we call lifespan, which Brian Donson and a lot of people talked about, versus health span, which Peter Attia talks about when he talks about medicine 1.0 versus 2.0 versus medicine 3.0, and how can you extend the viable stage of your life. And then we added a third term into this. So we had health span and lifespan, and then we added work span, because right about the time we were finishing up the report, Warren Buffett announced that he was going to retire at the end of this year at age 94. Now, right now, I think most folks would say that's exceptional, but I
Yeah.
actually would disagree. I mean, look at how many people in leadership, in industry, and in government are septuagenarians and octogenarians,
Yeah. Is
boomers.
that the norm? Is that becoming the norm, or is that going to shift to be the norm?
Right, right. And then how does that affect downstream generations?
There's
Um,
a lot that goes into that, right? You have the economics of, if I work until, if the average lifespan for a male is in the 70s, mid 70s. If the average lifespan for a male in the US becomes late 80s or 90s, what does that do to your earning potential? What does that do to compounding interest with just investments, right? 20 extra years of matching contributions between you and your employer in the stock market, right? That's a huge potential positive.
right.
But what does that do to the younger generation that's looking for work? If you have someone that's now able to work for 60 years on average, not just the exception, which is Warren Buffett.
Right. Yeah. So I think we're going to see all sorts of access, equity, and ethical issues to include, as you're living longer, what's the organ span, if you would, associated with lifespan and health span. And we already see people getting knees replaced in their 50s. They're walking the same day to leave the hospital and things like that. So a lot of ways this biohacking piece is going to go. And just to punctuate the fact that there's a lot of novel aspects to this, but there's also some really interesting historical or precedents to this. You discover some really interesting research about sea creatures with between the
Yeah.
octopus and the immortal jellyfish. So please tell us about that.
Yeah, so we were looking into the synthetic everything, right? The biology, data, humans. We talked about a little bit with the bodyoids, but as we're taking all of this data in, and we're finding new ways to use it in the health industry. They're doing great things with genetics. And I'll get to the answer kind of a long way, Jay, but AlphaFold is taking, proteins, and it's folding them in unique ways, mapping them out, understanding how all of these things work at the molecular level. We have, a set number of genes as humans, and we're able to kind of explore all those and map those out. And the octopus has 34,000 genes, 11,000 more than a human. There's also a jellyfish. It's the immortal jellyfish. When it is threatened, or when it nears the end of its life, it reverts back to its polyp form and starts over again. And if you look at the energy, right, around the weight loss drugs, around the cosmetic industry, around, Botox, all these things that are making us look younger. What if there was a genetic solution to not only delay aging, but to reverse aging, and then throw on their bodyoids? And hey, I'm going to get a knee replaced. Hey, I'm going to get my heart replaced, and I'm going to look younger. There's a lot that's being researched here that has economic, societal implications down the road. We talk about in our report, the 1%. Is there going to be a new health 1%? Those that have the means to be able to afford all of these new technologies that allow them to extend their health span beyond 100?
Yeah, that is a great question, Nate. I think there's going to be so many different implications here. And I would like to take one step back. You mentioned synthetic data at one point in time, but then you also talked about how biohacking and synthetic biology and these bodyoids could all be linked. I think what you did there is you really exposed the fact that these threads, they're not running in parallel. They're very much interwoven. Yeah. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about the synthetic data piece, because what we saw as part of this report is that in some respects, from just based on the strength of computational power that's out there and the reach and the size of large language models, we're starting to reach the limits of available data, either to train large language models or for AI systems that are going to operate in the physical world, where they simply haven't driven on a street or something like that. And so one of the mind-blowing aspects of our research and our report to me was this notion of synthetic data, where we're going to create data to train AI so that when it goes into the real world, it's got a foundational layer, either because there's simply not sufficient data to train it otherwise, or it's reached the limits of available data.
We kind of just talked around this, but this the quote from Ben Lamb sticks out right now. We talked, synthetic biology, data, artificial intelligence. He had a great speech at South by Southwest talking about Colossal, his company, and the de-extinction. But he said the combination of the access to compute, AI, and synthetic biology, that intersection is the most powerful set of technologies and potentially the most dangerous set of technologies the world may ever see. And we just scratched the surface, and we're going to continue to scratch at the surface because there's so much happening here. And I can't wait to deep dive this with you, all three of those threads, at a future podcast. But man, there's so much to dig at, right? It's great.
Right. So, speaking of which, we've had a great conversation about a number of the threads. And I'd say that's before we wrap up this podcast. Let's make sure we go back and revisit, hey, these are the 5 threads that went into the Pluot report, just as a punctuation mark. But I want to pull another thread from something you mentioned as well. And we were talking about health span in parallel to lifespan. So your body is living longer, but what's the quality of your life? There's a really interesting component to health span, and that is the importance of relationships and your mental health or your psychological well-being. And one of the things that really caught my attention is something I'm glad we dug deep on, is Scott Galloway during South by Southwest called testosterone the chemical of the year.
Yeah, that was amazing.
That was. And I really appreciate the approach we used to assess that, as we looked at it both physically as a chemical and its importance in terms of physical and psychological well-being at the right levels, men and women. So it's not just a male hormone, but also the fact that we looked at it from a metaphorical sense. and how there's this major element of disenfranchisement from society for young men, and a lot of statistics and data to support this conclusion that Galloway initially presented. We looked at and said there are a lot of reports and there's a lot of intelligence, business intelligence, or data that supports the fact that men are becoming increasingly disenfranchised and having less and less access in society.
Yeah, on that note, right, just a couple of stats to throw at you. 42% of college enrollment is male. 58% is female, right? So that's a trend that is decreasing. So there are less and less males that are going to college every year. 34% of men under the age of 30 live with their parents still, and that number is increasing. We have this, separation, or this detaching, of young males, the 18 to 24 under 30 age, that they're not joining the military, they're not going to church, they're not going to school, they're kind of just insulating themselves with themselves. And that's not a healthy response for society. And if you pair that with what we transitioned from, which is a longer health span for an aging population with less and less opportunities for a younger population, the implications of that potentially are pretty bleak. And it's something that we do need to discuss, and we need to look into solutions.
And some of the reporting that we're seeing now following the publication of the Pluot Report is showing that that's got political, economic, and societal implications that are pretty far-reaching.
Yeah, and I don't want to steal thunder from our next report, the Predictive Quarter, but there was a recent study that said that companies that are aligned with masculinity are doing better in terms of brand reputation. And so there's a lot that's going into this, masculinity, this testosterone, not the chemical, but what it represents in our society as a whole. That's just fascinating, and I can't wait to continue to pull on this thread as we continue this Red Thread X journey.
Absolutely, yeah. The manosphere has got far-reaching implications across society, and we're going to be digging deeper in that, not only in the podcast focus on that topic, but as we expose its broader reach and implications for our subsequent reports.
Yeah, there's a lot here. There's one more thread that we kind of we touched on briefly when we talked about the synthetic side of this with bodyoids, and that's embodied AI, right? Artificial intelligence beyond just your computer and your phone, and not what everyone's talking about, like, hey, AI is going to be big. Yes, thank you. We know that. But how is it going to be big, and why, right? It's moving from our computers to, our person, moving into living science, right? We saw a couple different technologies that are insane. A cyber jellyfish that is a combination of a jellyfish and a computer that's able to dive the depths and do some awesome stuff. Artificial skin that reacts to electronic stimulus, which is crazy. Waymo is one of the best examples of embodied AI. We saw this at South by Southwest in Austin, Jay. This taxi's driving around with no drivers. You can order it on an app. You can hop in it. It drops you off. No conversation because there's no one to converse with. It's just you. Yeah. But that is AI being employed in our physical space by itself. These robots are starting to live with us more and more. Just throw a number at you. 75% of all packages that Amazon delivers are touched by a robot. And it goes even more, and it goes deeper into the genetics of things too, which gets even crazier.
Oh, absolutely. And, you mentioned AI. I'd like to cover the last topic here as really a parallel to it. So part of our approach with the Red Thread reporting, our analysis, our embedding into these conferences is we don't want to just anchor onto and state the obvious. And if I said, hey, AI is a big deal in 2025, what's the value proposition in having a conversation about that or exploring it? No kidding. AI is front and center. It's absolutely dominating technology reporting, the deployment of various consumer products and commercial products and everything else. So we're not going to say AI. That's where we dive deeper. And like you said, Nate, we talk about what's the role of embodied AI, how AI is touching things like biohacking. Similarly, space, the space ecosystem is a huge deal right now.
That's our first Red Thread we had.
It is. We've got national actors there. And if we go back to 24, when we did our proof of concept for Red Thread X, we identified space was an emerging competitive environment for both corporations and for nations. And we're seeing that absolutely the case right now. You know, Kuiper being launched by Amazon to compete with Starlink from SpaceX. We're going to see all sorts of commercial and continued national competition in space when we look at Earth orbit. And so when we look at Earth orbit, we said, okay, that's clearly very present in terms of competition and opportunity for the terrestrial economy. But when we look beyond that, from a what's next perspective, what we saw very clearly is that the moon is also emerging as a competitive space and a cornerstone for what's called the cislunar economy. And if I could define that really quickly.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. The cislunar economy really means the Earth orbit, and the moon. So that includes all three of those. We already know that the moon has a lot of effect on Earth, whether it's the illumination or tidal impacts and things like that. But what we're going to see in our assessment is that the moon is unequivocally going to become part of this larger economy. And to put it in perspective, it's only 238,000 miles away. Yeah. And you can send data back and forth from the moon. And one of the companies we worked with during South by Southwest, Lone Star Data, they put a data store on the moon, and it was a 3-second latency for them to be able to transmit data back and forth from the Earth and the moon. And there's a lot of advantages to being on the moon. You know, you've got unlimited solar. You don't have any implications for solar energy through an atmosphere. You don't have to cool a data center on the moon because it's really
pretty
cold.
cold. It's really cold out there.
It's really cold. And there's also a lot of resources on the moon. But here's where it gets really sporty. Going back to that idea of governance and regulation and how fast technology is moving. What happens when the moon becomes a competitive environment, not only between nations, India, China, Russia, the US, having landed or seeking to land on the moon, seeking to establish bases, whether it's for Artemis or whether it's for resource extraction from the moon. What happens when you start to see competition between stakeholders on the moon, whether it's company on company or nation on nation or some hybrid thereof? And you helped me learn something really valuable as we were prepping this report, Nate. So why don't you share where we stand in terms of the governance and agreements that exist for space right now?
It's the Wild West, Jay. It's absolutely the Wild West. It's 2025, right? The laws that govern the moon were written in 1967 and 1979, respectively, when the only two players in space and the moon were the U.S. and the USSR. And the USSR is no more. And now you have all the nations that you mentioned, plus you have commercial entities, right? I mean, we saw a commercial entity land a data center on the moon at Red Thread X and South by, right? Not a nation, a commercial entity. You also have Nokia Bell, right? You have Vera Rubin. You have all these other companies that are playing with this. You have Jeff Bezos. You have Elon Musk. There's a lot of unregulated entities that are just running around doing what they think is best, which is great for innovation, but becomes pretty interesting if you're sitting there and you have a data center on the moon and a different actor, whether it's a nation state or a person, drops a rover and it's like, hey, I'm going to go check out that data, right? Well, hold on a minute. Who says you can do that? Well, who says you can't? Right. And it's becoming pivotal, right? Like, you know, Russia and China just said they're going to partner to put a nuclear research center on the moon. The Artemis, NASA said, "Hey, we need the moon. We're gonna kick off this Artemis plan to use the moon as potentially a launching pad to go beyond the moon to Mars and maybe even further out." And you know, this is big numbers too. McKinsey estimates that in 2035, the economy for the cislunar space is going to be 1.8 trillion. That's a T. $1.8 trillion. That's the market. And so there's a lot of people that are going to be running and sprinting to capture a portion of that market, right? Because a small percentage of a big number is a big number.
No kidding. So, you know, as we look towards what the next couple of weeks are going to hold, Nate, I think it's going to be really exciting as we take these 5 red threads. And I'd like to just recap them real quick. We've got the moon. We've got embodied AI. We've got synthetic everything. Biology, data, and humans. We've got biohacking, trying to keep people alive potentially forever. And then we've got testosterone, the chemical of the year, and its social and well-being implications as well as economic implications. And we're going to take each one of those topics. We're going to dive deep in a subsequent podcast and really explore the content that's in the report and what we're learning as we continue to maintain awareness of new information, new data on these threads, and as we map out the next set of red threads.
Yeah, well said, Jay. And our next episode is going to explore the moon, right? We're going to talk about the cislunar economy in depth, and we're going to share the things we know and the things that we learn, and it's going to be great. I can't wait to have this discussion because I can talk about this for a long time, and we're going to make it relevant, and we're going to make it succinct for our listeners. If you want to get a copy of our report and not wait until the next podcast, you can go to www.theredthreadx.com and you can download that report today. And we'd love your feedback on this. And I'm looking forward to these conversations, Jay.